Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre. With me is Z. In this episode, we've got some updates on the UMN story with the Linux kernel, some various vulns involving Brave and allocators, and the return of speculative execution attacks again. So we've got a lot of topics in this episode, so we'll just jump right into our first topic here, which is the update on the University of Minnesota and their dust up with the Linux kernel maintainers over faulty patches that were made. So yeah, lots of people, including the Linux maintainers, thought it was that it was in service of a bad faith effort to inject vulnerabilities with their hit commits paper, which we talked about briefly last week. But there was a bit of a dispute around that. The researchers kind of denied that, saying that was a separate thing and it was already finished off. So yeah, we covered it last week. It was a little bit hard to cover though, because we didn't really have all the puzzle pieces. Both UMN and Linux kernel maintainers have put out statements. So
last week there was actually a bit more information than we ended up covering. We ended up talking a lot about how these more recent commits didn't feel like they were actually part of that hypocrite commit research, just because of the difference in the style, like allowing them to go out to the stable branches and stuff. It was a complete violation of all like the practices that they had indicated that they were following. It turns out, actually, I believe it was last Saturday. So before we did the podcast episode, I just missed it, I guess. They had put out a statement, or we had been speculating that like UMN would have put out a statement indicating that it really wasn't from that, if that were the case. Turns out they did. They had a statement that indicated, like, yeah, that wasn't part of the hypocrite research, that the patches that actually caused all of the issues that kind of triggered everything ultimately were made in good faith. They were done improperly. They didn't indicate that it was from a automated system, so like a source scanner in this case, or actually, I guess it wouldn't be a source scanner. The research itself, they indicate, was about finding vulnerabilities introduced through patches. So kind of source scanning, not exactly. I don't know. That research itself hasn't been released yet, so we don't actually have the details on that. But those commits came from that paper. Honestly, like, I feel like the researcher there that ended up making those commits kind of got gaslit on this one. There were a lot of people saying, oh, well, he shouldn't have tried to lie about what they were doing and stuff. And it turns out, like, no, he was apparently being truthful, that this wasn't a bad faith commit. But yeah, so that statement did come out. They have actually kind of made it clear. They've also released a full disclosure file, which includes information about the actual hypocrite commits. And this includes, while the paper only talks about 3, apparently they had actually submitted 5. One of them was submitted accidentally, in the sense of they had just set up like the git send email using that account, forgot, and sent a proper patch in under it. So it was included in the study. None of the commits actually did hit the stable branches. None of them were, well, one of them was accepted, but it was the control patch. Like it was a proper patch, didn't have any bugs and whatever. The other patches, none of them were accepted, so none of them ended up hitting anyhow. Although they were rejected for reasons unrelated to the bug that they were introducing or trying to introduce. Honestly, I feel like this makes the kernel's response seem like an overreaction to everything. Like, yes, they should have followed the proper protocol for indicating that, hey, these patches are coming from an automated source. It's problematic that they didn't. Other maintainers, though, had seen that. One maintainer asked before all of this blew up, hey, did you find this using a source scanner, or did you find this manually? And he was told it was a source scanner. So they didn't hide that fact. And the maintainer didn't call them out for not marking it as, like, being from a source scanner. I mean, I think it's something that more warrants a warning, not like an outright ban of the entire university and just the assumption of bad faith.
Yeah, so both the researchers, or rather the university and the Linux maintainers, kind of put out a apology, kind of. I think it's less of an apology from the Linux side. So, like on the Linux side, they stated that 42 patches, I believe, out of 190 were being pulled and reverted. Greg originally threatened to pull all of them, as we covered last week, but after the anger died down, they didn't quite go that far. And there was a little bit of acknowledgement that, there was a bit of an overreaction and some heat of the moment, I guess, stuff said by Linux maintainers, but they also stated that from their point of view, posting patches from a static analysis tool without disclosing that it was a tool immediately um, is like experimentation on non-consenting humans, and it's a malicious act, which I think is extremely over-exaggerated.
That's
I don't
definitely a
really.
stretch. I didn't see that statement, or at least I didn't read it the same way you are, but yeah, that feels like a stretch. Like, I get them calling the original research some human experimentation. It was, in fact, that sort of experimentation. They were looking to see if the patch reviewers, humans, would indeed let the patches through. Like, there are clear questions about what um about the form of the research. And that ultimately is why this paper did end up getting withdrawn from Oakland 21. There's another link to that, or at least that's part of the reason. They don't want their process to be an example of how this research should be performed. Obviously, a lot of pressure on it. I doubt it would have, or I imagine the organizers might have considered removing it just because of all the bad press, regardless of whether or not the authors had. And for what it's worth, I will also mention that there's an apology letter from the authors of that hypocrite research, and the authors of that paper are not the same as the authors of the commits that ended up triggering all of these problems.
It basically seems like that classic issue of painting everyone with the same brush. The Linux maintainers were just like, "Oh, this university has done this before, so let's just like think that those are all made in bad faith." Like, I don't know. It was kind of weird from like the maintainers' point of view. They really jumped the gun on it, and I kind of stated this last week, but it has been disappointing to see how many people have just jumped to the executioner's block for these researchers who literally all they like. The only thing here that they did that was bad was they didn't disclose immediately that their patches were the results of static analysis, which is like a benign mistake. Like, there have been other organizations and entities that have made commits into the kernel that have done worse, for sure. It's just that they got grilled because they got tangentially attached to that other research that happened, like,
From the
was
same
already
university.
finished.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
this is going to show up in at least the one commit authors. Like, you ever Google his name, this is going to come up for a long time. Um
Yeah, background checks are not gonna be fun for these researchers, unfortunately. Um, that said, like, hopefully, like, if they were caught in a background check, if they were interviewing for a job or something, they would hopefully get the chance to like explain it. But I mean, I don't
Ideally,
know.
but given how quickly some people jumped on this, like, that's also why I want to recover this topic to kind of make it clear what happened, because I do kind of believe that the corrections need to be as publicized as the original incident. Of course, it won't be, but I do think they should be.
Yeah, it sucks because there's a few tech channels and stuff that I watch that I really respect, and they completely took the Linux maintainer side of the story. They didn't even cover the arguments on the other side or like any of the corrections. So it's really unfortunate, but yeah, it seems like a lot of people just either don't care or are just not being made aware of it. So yeah, I've kind of wanted to bring a little bit of attention to that. But at least there was somewhat of an acknowledgement of wrongdoing on both sides. There was a little bit by Linux maintainers saying that some of the maintainers didn't agree, with Greg's original threat and
Yeah,
idea of
and
that. But
in fairness, we're kind of wrapping up the whole of the Linux kernel maintainer community as like one group and UMN as another, but there were maintainers who spoke out against it pretty early on too. So, it's not just everybody as one brush, but speaking in generalities.
Yeah, we shouldn't try to make it like a battle where there's only two sides. That's fair. The way I was talking about it did kind of make it sound that way. But yeah, I mean, in regards to the maintainers that we've covered, like on the post that we're showing, and Greg and the people that were in that thread. But yeah, that's good to bring up. Like, obviously, not all the maintainers are in one bucket. So yeah. It also seems Greg hasn't really commented on this issue. I don't know if you've seen anything that would contradict that.
No, I haven't. I didn't look for much this week though, but last I saw, I had not seen any real comment from Greg, which I mean, fine. We'll let the comments come out from what's the board's name? Whatever the board was that actually made this statement. Linux Foundation Technical Advisory Board tab. There we go.
Yeah, so I kind of want a statement from Greg or some form of acknowledgement of like that he jumped the gun, because I feel like if there was somebody who kind of does deserve a little bit of blame in this situation, it would probably be him. But I don't know. I guess we'll see as time goes on. If he doesn't address it, then that's totally within his right. But yeah, we'll see. All right, so we'll move on to our next topic that got some people in a bit of a bad mood, I guess, which was GitHub, who put out a proposal and call for feedback for updating their policy regarding exploits and malware.
Yeah, and I think it's important that this was a call for comments, not just like, hey, we're changing this immediately, here's what the new policy is, but here's what we're suggesting as new policy, what's wrong with it? And there was a pretty strong reaction. Somewhat, I argue, undeservedly, but at the same time, the InfoSec community tends to jump on any sign of censorship, of security tooling and exploits and write-ups.
They're very territorial in that respect.
Well, like every time a YouTube video gets removed, somebody's, on the horn about it. And it's kind of fair because this is, in a sense, like our livelihood. Our jobs are based around some of these disclosures. So starting to see that being risked, like you speak up. Like I'm not entirely against that. Like bring it up, whatever. It does feel a little bit excessive. That said, so in this case, what happened is the main change, or at least the main change that I would argue for, is that they had changed the line contains or install. This is something that you cannot do, to be clear. Contains or installs any active malware or exploits or uses our platform for exploit delivery, such as part of a command and control system. And they replaced that with contains or installs malware or exploits that are in support of ongoing and active attacks that are causing harm. That, I think, is kind of one of the central places. They have a little bit that defines certain terms. There's a few other changes in there. This, I think, was the big one. And it like in my initial read of it, you kind of read that as, so they've removed the necessity of it being the active malware. Now it's like malware or exploits that are in support of ongoing and active attacks. So what is ongoing and active? Does that mean if a pen tester is using it, it's an active attack? There are some really old vulnerabilities still being used by a random worm. Is that an active attack? And causing harm is really vague. That said, they've come out with a couple comments on the actual PR, clarifying that their point with making these changes here was that they felt that the existing terms were actually a little bit hostile towards like the dual use software like Metasploit or any like scanners. Basically all sorts of exploit software would be considered dual use because you can use it for legal or illegal purposes. They felt the existing terms, so they wanted to narrow the policy and scope with regards to what they would restrict, not increase it, or at least that's what they state their goal was. They've acknowledged the feedback, the many comments that have come through. I presume that's going to mean that we'll see yet another PR after this that probably, or this one probably won't go forward as is. Sounds like they've made more or less the proper response here. I think it's fair to talk about it or point it out, but not much to really worry about. I think their intent here is good, to make it more clear what you can or can't do, and narrow the actual scope from it is somewhat vague in the original terminology also.
So I do think it's weird how it seems like the implementation completely flies in the face of the goals. Because like I read the blog post they made, and they stated like they wanted to focus on addressing the gray area of allowing code in support of security research, but disallowing the actively harmful content, and try to clear up some of the ambiguity around exploits and malware and whatnot. But this does the opposite. I actually think the way they had it worded before was a lot more clear than the way they have it worded in this PR.
So did I originally. At first I was thinking, yeah, that it seems like, I actually have in my notes a little comment there, that seems like, well, it's one thing for them to say that they want to protect from the overly broad language, but their change seems to become more broad by removing the qualifiers. But actually looking at the change, like they basically moved the any act of malware. Like, they remove that in a sense, but they push it over and include it with the exploits, malware or exploits that are in support of the act of attacks. You could kind of read that as being more vague, but I could understand why somebody who was maybe writing that might think of it as actually being more specific. Now they're saying the act of malware, and it has to be causing harm. Now harm ends up being vague, and there's questions about that. But I don't know, I could understand where somebody's coming from when they read this and think that it's actually becoming a little bit more specific. And I can understand why, obviously, we read it as being less specific. I mean, and this is kind of the point of getting feedback.
Yeah, it kind of depends on which side of the fence you land on, I guess. Yeah, I mean, like you said, I think it's good that they didn't just make this change and push it through like a lot of other platforms do. I like that they have the call for feedback, and like I was scrolling through the comments, and there were some really angry people. But
there are a lot of comments, yeah, and a lot of angry comments. And yeah, I think it's a good process.
The back and forth though that came from like on the PR was generally positive. Like there, outside of the kind of silly comments that people just ignored, I guess. I think there was some good back and forth. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I think people were a little bit too angry, and again, I kind of sound like a broken record, but they kind of jumped the gun.
Assuming bad faith.
Yeah, exactly. Jumped the gun on going after GitHub and saying, oh, they're coming after us again. It's just another platform going after us. But no, like, I do think they have a reason, and a good reason for wanting to address these issues. I just don't think that this is a particularly good implementation, which, like you said, that's the whole point of call for feedback. So yeah, hopefully we see a better implementation at some point, and if we do, we'll probably cover it on the podcast in one form or another. All right, so DEF CON quals happened this weekend, keeping on the train of things that people were mad about. So Order of the Overflow, I think this is their third year organizing DEF CON CTF. DEF CON CTF will be a little bit more interesting this year than last year, because last year it was like totally online, even for the finals. This year, DEF CON is going to a hybrid model, which we wanted to talk about on the podcast, but we totally forgot about at the time, I think. DEF CON is going to be in person, though, this year, as well as online. So, yeah, CTF will have the in-person component, I believe. I don't know if they said anything definitive on that yet.
Yeah, I'm not sure how the CTF, like the main game, is actually going to get organized this year.
It'll be interesting to see, because I could see them not wanting to force teams to go there where travel's going to be difficult. If you're outside of the US and you're not vaccinated, you can't go, basically. So, yeah, I mean, well, even if you're in the US and not vaccinated, you can't go. They have vaccination as a requirement. But anyway, like, it'll be interesting to see how the finals play out. But yeah, quals happened this weekend. There were some complaints around the challenges. The biggest thing that I think I saw going around was the fact that there were no web challenges this year. It was basically all reversing Pwn and crypto, I believe. So, people who like their web chals were kind of rubbed the wrong way. One thing that, a comment that somebody made that I wasn't totally sure on was, did Legit BS do web chals? or was that kind of something that Order of the Overflow themselves kind of introduced in their previous years? I
Yeah,
wasn't really around for the legit BS era, so I don't really know for a fact on that.
yes and no is kind of the answer on that one. Generally speaking, no, legit BS didn't do a lot of web challenges, as far as I remember and can tell. I do have memory of one web challenge that ended up being a kernel exploit. There was an RCE, so it got tossed in as web, but then there was an actual, like, kernel exploit to get the flag, so, you know, you could call that web, but not really. The RCE, I remember being pretty easy. That said, when I was trying to find which DEF CON qual that actually was, I couldn't figure it out, so it might have been during the DD Tech era also, so like 09 to 13, 12? I don't remember exactly what year legit BS took over. Might have been in that era too. That said, as far as I could tell, there was only really 1 year where legit BS did some web challenges. To any significant degree, and they were kind of web/crypto challenges for the most part. Which was, I believe 2013 had the 3-dub category, which is your www category. So generally speaking, yeah, DEF CON qualifiers has been more binary focused, which is fair because DEF CON main game is binary folks, and this is the qualifiers for the main game. But yeah, it does seem like Order of the Overflow, in terms of having some really quality web challenges for DEF CON quals, it is kind of something they started.
Okay. So even if you put the web stuff aside, though, there were still some unhappy campers around even the binary challenges. And that mostly comes down to the fact that it falls into that category of CTF challenge where it's made difficult, but not in an interesting way. It's just like made annoying just to be annoying. And an example of that would be, like, I looked at a few of the write-ups for the challenges. So to make it clear, I didn't participate in qualifiers this year. I don't think you did either, Z.
I'll also state, I at least kind of look at a couple of challenges this year. Like, I just kind of lost interest. Like, it's not that I have an issue really with Order of the Overflow, but playing their challenges in the past years, I just personally haven't really enjoyed their challenges and kind of their challenge design. That could definitely be on just me. I just haven't really enjoyed these challenges, so I haven't been playing. And this year, I'm just like, you know, every year it's just kind of been less and less. This year, I just didn't play.
Yeah, so I looked at some of the write-ups for some of the challenges this year, and it was interesting because looking at the Pwn challenge write-ups, you expect the write-up to be about, you know, a little bit about finding the issue, but also exploiting the issue and getting the flag. A lot of the time, pretty much the 80% of the write-up was reversing, and that and I say a lot of the time is if I looked at all the challenges. At the time when I looked at the write-ups, there was only, I think, 4 challenges up. But yeah, and like 2 or 3 of them, like most of the write-up was reversing, and that's because for their Pwn challenges, they put out like stripped, statically linked binaries out with no source code or anything. Which no source code is fairly common, I think, for Pwn challenges, but like intentionally statically linking it and then stripping it as well, making it so you have to basically reverse the binary to even find the issue, unless you just like throw it in AFL or something. But
and I mean, reversing isn't like, I mean, it is part of the game, but when it comes to challenge design, just tossing that on there, it's kind of like an artificial challenge. The challenge isn't hard. The challenge isn't hard because of needing to do this reverse engineering. It's just tedious. The challenge itself is still kind of focused on whatever the exploit is, you know, being a Pwn challenge, Pwn being the primary part. The reversing is just like this extra step that is kind of unnecessary to the actual exploit and artificially makes it harder. Like, I've kind of, with challenges that I've done, I kind of follow the idea of making a challenge, and this is really easy to misunderstand, but keeping challenges as easy as possible, but no easier. And that might come off as being like, okay, just make easy challenges. That's not really what I mean. I just mean, like, don't add any extra fluff that artificially makes something more difficult. If the core of the challenge isn't difficult, then it's just not a difficult challenge. And you, as long as the core of the challenge isn't being obscure, then it's kind of okay. I don't know. It's hard to. I haven't really set out to explain my philosophy, but
I guess if I tried to summarize it, it would just be like, keep your challenge centralized to like the crux of it. Like, don't just try to throw a bunch of barriers to make it so you have to go through layers to even get to the issue. That just makes your challenge annoying, not fun. So I think that was kind of the problem that people had with these challenges, is that it was intentionally made more difficult than it needed to be. Like the actual vulnerabilities, like when I read the write-ups and got to the vulnerabilities, it was pretty straightforward. It was like, oh yeah, it gave me an arbitrary file right, and I just used that to, like, you know, do stuff. Like, it wasn't really complex in the exploitation angle. It was just a lot of work to get there. And that seemed to be like a common thread. There were people who put like their timelines, and they were like, I spent all of Friday and Saturday reverse engineering this in Ghidra, and then on Sunday I was able to exploit it. Like, people don't want to do that in a 48-hour timed CTF. And I think that, and it basically makes DEF CON challenges like manpower oriented. It's not down to interesting design. It's just how many people can you throw at the problem. That's basically what it turns it into. And when you have these massive teams that are competing, I mean, you can't really compete against them when you make the problems oriented like that. It's like, if you don't have the number of team members, you are screwed. You're not going to win. So that's why I think people had a lot of problems with the challenges. And that seems to be kind of what the previous years have hinted to me with Order of the Overflow as well. I played with a couple of the challenges last year, and I wasn't a big fan either.
Personally. Yeah, like I will say, I do think OO has had some really cool ideas in their challenges. Like, I don't fault them on like some of the crazy ideas, like going multi-arch for one of them. I remember, I think it was last year before. Like, they've had some really cool ideas for the challenges. It's just the implementation tends to make the crux of the challenge that they're designing this artificial hindrance or hurdle to get over, rather than actually making an enjoyable part of the challenge. So I don't know. I mean, it's a difference in design. Like I said, I just personally haven't really enjoyed OO as the organizers. It's nothing really against them. They just haven't been for me, so I haven't played. I can't speak about this year's, like I said, but I've seen a lot of comments like that. The other comment I've seen in response there is, you know, how old school players, you know, were fine with all the pwn, and, you know, it's just people complaining now. And I mean, CTFing has become very different than it was even like 10 years ago. Like, just the difficulty of the challenges, the time involved, the difficulty of exploitation has risen quite a bit since then too. But in order to make challenges that are kind of hard for everybody, like, balls needs to be hard. They can't just have like a bunch of easy challenges. So I get the idea that this is a qualifier for one of the biggest or most important games in CTF, like DEF CON main game. It's gotta be hard. So my issue hasn't really been with the difficulty of the challenges, but the actual design, I guess. And I feel like other people are kind of echoing that same statement. Just, they're hard, but not in the fun way.
Yeah, it seemed like this is anecdotal, because obviously I don't talk to every CTF player that participated, but it seemed like overall the sentiment was pretty negative. Regarding what you were saying, yeah, so Order of the Overflow on their Twitter put out this tweet that rubbed some people the wrong way. They had this old school CTFers and modern CTFers meme where it was like, OMG, too guessy, bad labels, I only know web crypto. Like, just kind of making fun of, like, I guess, newer CTFers that were complaining. There were people that were really angry in the tweets saying this is gatekeeping and it's anti-beginner.
DEF CON quals are not beginner CTF. I'll say that simply. Like, you know, that's not the issue. I do like this okay boomers response, though.
So I do think it's kind of a dumb meme, and it's like Order of the Overflow is just, they don't want to deal with the criticism. They're like, oh, whatever, we feel like we're the best, and these people are just complaining for no reason, so let's just meme on them. I feel like they're kind of avoiding legitimate criticism with the way they've responded. That said, like with the anti-beginner stuff, I mean, yeah, DEF CON is not meant to be a beginner CTF, and I kind of liked Cyphertex's tweet reply from Binary Ninja. He said, like, there's plenty of other CTFs that are tailored specifically at a wider variety of skills or skill levels. Not every CTF has to be everything to everyone. And I think that last sentence with not every CTF has to be everything to everyone is a good statement to echo, because a lot of people, like, it's easy to get into the mindset of thinking a CTF should be tailored towards you. Like, oh, I didn't invite the CTF, just sucks then. Like, it's easy to kind of fall into that trap. But yeah, I mean, there's lots of CTFs out there. Unfortunately, and I don't want to go too deep into this discussion because we're already 30 minutes into the show. We'll probably do a separate discussion video on this. I do think CTFs in general are kind of heading in a direction that I personally don't like. A lot of the challenges are going towards, like, here's a product that we reintroduced an end day into, go and exploit it. Like, it's like the creativity seems to be kind of lost in the CTF space in general. But
did you see that in any DEF CON one? That, I mean, I've seen that with some, but I don't know. That's kind of been the type.
DEF CON specifically had an end day one, but I could be wrong on that. I'm
like,
not 100% sure.
That's something that's been around for quite a while. It's just been the type of CTF I just don't bother with.
Yeah, but it just seems like those kinds of, I guess, filler challenges are being thrown in more and more.
Okay.
It's like, oh, we can't make really hard challenges for these teams, so let's just take a real world bug and throw them at them. Like, it's kind of like the lazy approach in my mind, but
no, that's fair. I just haven't really seen that. So to be clear, like as I already said, I didn't play this year, and I've kind of been stepping down out of CTF since like 2015, just not really playing as much as casual if I do.
Yeah. I do think, like, trying to play CTF competitively, like trying to place first or something, if you're an individual, I think it is kind of a fool's errand at this point in CTF.
It depends on the CTF. Like, not teams. In the competitive ones, though, no. And LM on PC and chat mentions, imagine thinking professional CTF should be beginner friendly. Like, yeah, I mean, when it comes to DEF CON quals, like, it's got to be a hard... Or really with any of the qualifier CTFs, they've got to be difficult. And that's completely fair. Yeah.
It's a gate to finals. Yeah.
I mean, it is literal gatekeeping.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I think we will do a discussion video around, like, CTFs and I guess our thoughts on them. But I won't go too deep into that in this discussion. Overall, I wish that Order of the Overflow was a little bit more receptive to the feedback instead of just trying to, like, fight against it with these memes and stuff. Because I do think, like you said, I think they have some cool ideas. I just wish the implementation was a little bit more thought out, I guess, and more interesting than just, let's just make this as hard as possible by throwing all these annoying gotchas in there. Like, because they put red herrings in challenges a lot too. So that's another thing that I kind of don't like about CTFs. But anyway, yeah, DEF CON quals did happen. For those wondering about the results, PPP placed first. Not really much of a surprise there. I mean, PPP is pretty much one of the best teams in the world. So, but yeah, if you want to check out the results, though, they have the scoreboard up. There's also the write-ups on CTF time and whatnot. There should be more on there now as time goes on. But yeah, so feel free to check those out if you're interested. But yeah, overall, didn't seem like the vibe was too positive on the quals this year. All right, so up next we have Bad Alec, which was a quick post by MSRC about vulnerabilities and memory allocators. I kind of put vulnerabilities in quotes a little bit because I'm not totally sure if I agree with that phraseology. But we'll get into that, I guess. Yeah,
we had a bit of a discussion about it in the Discord. Core issue, I mean, I'm on the side of this being a vulnerability and so they have 25 CVs for it, so 25 separate vulnerabilities. But the core thing here, and why they've called it Bad Alloc, is that effectively what they found is various allocators, in particular ones widely used by real-time operating systems like embedded software, usually like constrained environments. In their allocators, they would have issues in calculating the size of certain allocations, leading to integer overflows within the allocators themselves. So I think one of the more common examples was in the calloc implementations, trying to you would provide both a number of elements and a size of each element, and then it would allocate you a contiguous memory block that could contain that many elements of that size. So a classic way that it could implement the calloc interface is multiply, number of elements times size of each element and allocate that space. Obvious issue there being an integer overflow is possible when you do that multiplication, and if it doesn't check on it, it'll actually allocate a smaller space than what you asked for, resulting in a heap overflow. So like when an allocator does that, that's definitely a vulnerability. Like the allocator's in the wrong, that is a bug, that is an issue there. The actual case in which it's going to be exploitable, the program more or less has to kind of have some issues also to be trying to make such a giant allocation. But I'd put the blame on the allocator for not returning a null or returning an error case if it can't actually service the allocation, rather than having the integer overflow in the multiplication or other calculation.
Yeah, so I think the overflow you mentioned is an issue, and I guess I kind of said earlier that I wasn't totally sure about vulnerability. Okay, I'll say it's fine to call it a vulnerability because it is an issue. That said, my problem was more along the lines of what you were just talking about. Your application has to be either doing insanely large allocations, or letting users pass their own insane arbitrary values to it. At that point, I feel like your code is already on some shaky ground. That, to me, in and of itself, is an issue, just letting a user allocate as much memory as they want like that. Now, maybe it might not lead to memory corruption if this issue wasn't in the allocator, but it is you have to have a very specific circumstance for this issue to actually impact you. And the reason that I take a bit of an issue with it is MSRC really tried to play this issue up. They did the named vulnerability thing, calling it bad alloc. And they did an advisory for IoT devices and whatever. It's like, if you are going to be affected by this issue, you probably already have bigger problems with your code base. It's IoT, so you already did have bigger problems. But yeah, I just feel like MSRC was really trying to play this up a lot compared to how impactful it actually is.
Yeah, the other thing is just calling it bad alloc. Part of the reason for using a named vulnerability is to be able to kind of talk about the issue, to add more clarity by grouping them all together with a memorable name. This is just incorrect size calculations or integer overflows. We have a name for this already. It's not new.
Yeah, we're renaming integer overflows. So, yeah, I feel like this was played up a bit, but it's fair to call out the issues. I believe were the issues they called out in UC libc out? Oh no, wait, I think that's another topic. I'm kind of conflating with this one. Because they talk about multiple allocators.
Well, so they do talk about at least one some existing in a libc, but not necessarily glibc.
Yeah. I was just trying to see if I could find exactly which libc they were talking about, but I couldn't. We do have a topic later on that touches on UC libc, so I was kind of...
That's this one, UC libc-ng versions prior to 1.0.36.
Okay, there is something else later on with them, too. But, yeah, okay, fair enough. So that kind of validates that a little bit. But anyway, yeah, overall, it's a fair issue to call out, but it was played up a little bit, so... But...
And
yeah,
I will just
kind of get the name on for the episode.
Shout out. This was Microsoft Section 52. I can find absolutely nothing about Section 52 besides this report, and they come up on one other page that mentions them.
It's uber top secret.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is a very ominous name, Section 52. It's It's like Area 52 or Area 51. Sorry.
Palo Alto Networks, they have Unit 42 as one of their threat intelligence groups.
Yeah, it's like a military kind of term, you know. Makes it sound more scary. You never talk about Section 52. Yeah, exactly. All right, so we'll move into another one of our big topics, which is the return of speculative execution attacks. So, unlike the last one we covered, this one affects both AMD and Intel, where the last one we covered a few episodes back was only affecting AMD. Even ARM this time around, actually, is mentioned in the abstract. The 3 attacks are also a lot more impactful than the recent one we covered with AMD, because one of them is cross-domain and crosses the userland and kernel boundary. Another one is cross-SMT thread. And the third one is transient execution that can leak secrets before the instruction is even dispatched to execution, which means that the previous speculative execution attacks, or the previous speculative execution mitigations like LFENCE are basically useless here. So
yeah, and I'll just shout out
a lot of stuff to unpack there.
The cross SMT one, I believe, is only AMD. The vulnerability itself, or the timing side channel, exists within the micro operation cache, and that is not shared across like hyperthreads on Intel. So the cross SMT thread one only impacts AMD, or some AMD processors, not all of them. Okay. But kind of jumping forward onto what the actual issue is, like Spectre was just alluding to, it happens, or it gets around things like LFENCE and existing mitigations. So that, I think, is kind of the novel thing here, the important thing. But the core of the issue, like I mentioned, this micro-op or UOP cache, is basically when the processor goes to decode instructions, so reads in the bytes on the processor cycle, reads them in, fetches however many, and then needs to decode them, those what they'd call macro ops, into micro ops. So that is the microcode that actually kind of implements each instruction. That is kind of an expensive process, so there exists the cache that instead of fetching and decoding, it can just stream them out of the cache instead. So that creates the observable timing side channel, where depending on which instructions are executed, they may be fetched out of the cache, or they might be decoded. Obviously, the cache is going to be much quicker to actually perform. What's interesting about this one is because it's in that instruction cache, or in like that decoding process, it's before any of the instructions are executed. And that means that like something like an LFENCE, which controls speculation across that boundary, like the actual execution of it, it's happening before it executes the instruction or sees the instruction. So it basically just happens too late. So the existing mitigations are happening too late to actually have an impact on this one. So I thought that's a really neat area. The paper ends up going into like details about the actual replacement strategy and use for the micro-op cache. Now hot code, recently executed code, will be in there. They talk about their own little displacement attack to determine which UOPs were recently executed. Kind of giving you a lot more details, but the gist of it is being able to leak kind of a secret dependent jump or branch, so you can know if it took a branch or not. And that's really kind of the gist of it.
Yeah, so I'll kind of put the usual disclaimer when we talk about this topic here as well. Just saying that we can't go super deep into the technical details because the microcode level and like CPU speculation is not really Z's or my field. We don't go that low level. So yeah, I mean, this is kind of like our understanding from reading the paper. Obviously, when you get to speculation and these kinds of performance optimizations with like the micro-op cache, it does get pretty complex at that level. So we are kind of hand-waving a little bit there. But the paper does go into the deeper details on that cache and how it works, and the differences between like the traditional instruction and data caches and the micro-op cache.
The paper gives a lot of the details and on like what, like the background and on exploiting it. But like at a high level, I mean, you can kind of understand the fact that it's a cache and there's the timing side channel. John Masters also kind of did a good overview of it. I've included the link.
Oh, nice. Okay, I never saw this, so just taking a quick glance over it.
Yeah, you'll learn everything you need while we're on the podcast.
Thank you. No, it does look like it's a very useful resource. Yeah, I'm looking and it's defining like some of the terms, and yeah, this definitely looks like it's worth a read. Just taking a quick glance at it and seeing what it's covering. Looks like it could be useful for giving you the background in a less dry manner, I guess. But yeah, I mean, what's important for this attack is the fact that as this cache works differently than the caches previously used by like previous speculative execution attacks. Those previous mitigations can't really defend against it, which means that in order to fix this issue, there's probably going to be more performance detrimental patches that are going to be needed. And I did see some interesting discussion on forums like Hacker News with some very defeatist attitudes stating, like, if you keep looking for these types of issues, you'll find them, and saying the only way to stop it is to get rid of speculation entirely, which they don't want because that would roll back years of performance improvements. So it seems like there was a common sentiment in that thread around we want to keep speculation and keep the good performance, even if these issues just keep kind of popping up out of the woodwork. I'm a bit curious on your thoughts, Z, there, on your thoughts between like the security boundary and the performance, or the security performance trade-off, I guess.
So I guess one thing to point out is one of the big differences, at least as I understand, between this one and some of the older ones is the fact that it's able to use speculation on instructions that may have been executed rather than on data. So I know with previous ones, you could leak information about secret dependent to data read rather than jump. So like it is just a different attack going on. As for your question, though, I'm kind of mixed on it. On one hand, I want to say, yeah, go security, do all that. On the other hand, the threat is a malicious code already running on your machine able to do this, which is generally JavaScript.
Yeah, the browser is the big one that I think people were hand-waving away or not really considering. While code execution on a victim machine is a high ask in many cases, the browser is kind of that special case where it's really easy to get JavaScript executing on a machine, and we've seen before with some speculative execution attacks, that is enough. Now, there were mitigations introduced to prevent the browser from being able to take advantage of, I think it was Meltdown that the browser was able to take advantage of. So, yeah, I mean, there were some mitigations on that front, but it's like the browser is an important thing to keep in mind when discussing this topic, I think, because it shouldn't be discounted at all.
Yeah, like, it's definitely a risk. I don't think this one's, like, world-ending. Like, the press release just calls it, like, defenseless as, like, the headlining word. That feels a little bit... it feels like a little bit of an exaggeration in terms of this actual attack. Like, I don't think this is a world-ending type of issue. Steps should be taken to mitigate it. People can decide to turn that off or on. Out of chat, Philip the Cat asks, can you get the JIT to produce invalid instructions, though? I don't think so. I mean, apart from a bug, you probably shouldn't be able to.
Yeah, you would probably have to get memory corruption in the JIT engine or something.
And that's true. Another question from Rude Email is, I wonder if WASM can have some. Again, WASM, because it's being interpreted, the actual instructions being executed without a bug, you shouldn't have invalid instructions coming out of the WASM chain either.
Yeah, WASM is kind of misleading in that way, I guess. Like, it's easy to think it's actually running at, like, the assembly level when it's what's being interpreted. Yeah, so, I mean, I kind of get the idea of not wanting to hinder performance, and it will be interesting to see what the patch ends up looking like for these issues when they're introduced into, like, the kernel and stuff. It'll be interesting to see the performance overhead. Because
Disclosure
some
is
of the
another
initial...
interesting thing here. Sorry to just interrupt you, but I knew I'd forget about that. They didn't disclose their timeline for the disclosure. Seems like they made this disclosure before any sort of patch was out.
Yeah, I haven't seen any like references or links to patches for this issue. That doesn't mean they don't exist, but it's just maybe they're kind of hidden or haven't been really publicized very much. But
yeah, all that gets mentioned is that one of the authors has a close connection with Intel because he was an intern there. And that's all that's really mentioned about any sort of disclosure. So I don't know if there's much of any disclosure that happened like beforehand, or if they just kind of dropped this. Obviously, it's going to be presented at a conference in June, ISCA, which I forget what that stands for.
Yeah. But yeah, like I'll be interested to like if somebody can find the patch, if it's already been made or when the patch is actually made. It would be interesting to see the performance implications, because the performance implications of some of the initial like Spectre and Meltdown patches were insane in terms of overhead. Like if I remember right, they were like double-digit percents that were lost in performance on Intel. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what performance looks like after those patches. In regards to the argument I kind of brought up from Hacker News, I mean, I can kind of understand why you would be wary of the patches for speculative execution, especially like where I said the browser is kind of a case that you have to consider. Like I said, with Meltdown, they were able to mitigate it without significantly hindering performance. I believe what they did with Meltdown was they basically made it so JavaScript no longer gets accurate timers, or at least in the major browsers, that's what they did. They made it so JavaScript can't get like finite timing information in order to get that side channel established, or it was just like a useless side channel. So if you can do things like that on the browser side and try to protect the most vulnerable applications, then yeah, I would kind of agree with the impact of speculative execution being pretty limited. If you have to run like a C binary or be able to run assembly directly on a machine, that is a pretty high ask. Like if it can cross the userland and kernel boundary, that is a little bit scary. But in most cases, that crossing comes in the form of like an info leak. If you can't compromise kernel integrity directly, like you can't trigger like a memory corruption or something, then I think it's less of an issue, because info leak in kernel is not super difficult to do anyway if you have code execution already. Like I've kind of said it before when we talked about speculative execution, but it's one of those things where there's often going to be an easier route you can take in an actual attack scenario. Is an attacker going to use speculative execution? Probably not, unless they absolutely have to and they have nothing else, because it's not the most ideal way to compromise a target. So yeah, I do feel like spec exec is kind of blown up a little bit out of proportion in terms of impact. That said, I don't think we should just ignore it entirely. They are issues. We should try to address them. But yeah, it's a tough area, because it's one area where, like, when we talk about exploits on this podcast and patches for them, it's very rare that we ever consider like performance implications of a patch. Like it's just not even in the discussion. But in speculative execution, it is, because it's in such a sensitive component in how the CPU works. So yeah, it's kind of a tough issue, I guess. K9 saying apparently two new ones just dropped. 2 new speculative execution attacks, like beyond the ones that were covered in this paper, you mean? Or I just need a little bit of clarification on what you mean by that for me to be able to talk about it. But anyway, yeah, I mean that's pretty much all I have to say on this topic. Yeah, I'm just mostly looking forward to what the patches look like, honestly, for the future for me. I think so. It was tweeted earlier today. Don't know if it's this specific paper or not. Okay, fair enough. So we probably won't be able to comment on that in the podcast, but I will take a look at them, and maybe we can talk about it in the Discord a little bit, or we can make a tweet about it or something if people are curious. But for now, we'll move on to some of our exploits of the show. Non-speculative execution exploits, anyway.
Only took us an hour to get here.
Yeah, usually we're here like 30 minutes ago, but today's a really packed episode. So, our first exploit topic is Brave on Android, and a vulnerability that can allow remote cookie stealing through a malicious web page. The issue basically comes down to the content URI, and that can be used to download the cookie jar from its own private data storage into the publicly accessible downloads folder. That kind of provides a foothold.
The issue there being that Brave itself configures itself so that its root directory for the file provider is its actual root. So you can access both public and private files, including cookie file.
Yeah, so that's the main thing of the issue, is that you can leak across that boundary. So they reported that the blog post does get a little bit more interesting when they try to see if they can hit it from a remote context, because obviously, if you can pull the cookie jar file into the public downloads folder, that's great. But if you don't have access to the user's private download folder, public download folder, through a malicious application, then what good does that really do you? So they actually found a way to be able to abuse the same functionality to get an HTML file downloaded, which would then use an iframe in a second stage through another tab to extract and send the cookie file to an attacker-controlled server. So I thought the converting it into a remote attack aspect was pretty interesting. But basically, the issue just boils down to allowing that URI handler to access the private file store and being able to cross that boundary of private and public storage on the device. This issue would require user interaction, so it's not zero-click. Since you would need to go to an attacker-controlled web page to start off the attack. But I mean, that's not a huge ask, so it's still a decently impactful issue, which Brave agreed with, as they rated it as a critical issue and paid a $500 bounty. In terms of timeline, the initial bugs were reported in the middle of May last year. Fixes were deployed in the middle of June, but there was apparently a regression or something, so the issue was then finally refixed on October 23rd. I thought that was kind of interesting because it's not often we see regressions mentioned in exploit timelines. But yeah, relatively quick and straightforward issue. But it's kind of neat. It's not the kind of exploit we typically cover on the show. So just wanted to.
I thought the actual exploit strategy was kind of cool on how they took advantage of it, turned into a remote issue.
Yeah, for sure. So we have our weekly OAuth-based issue that allows takeover of Facebook accounts through CrowdTangle, which is a social media monitoring platform for brands to use.
I mean, they abuse OAuth. It's not really an OAuth issue, though.
Yeah, so the issue itself is a little bit weird, and it does involve... it's basically an issue in the control flow for the OAuth. And it basically comes down to being able to use redirects in order to steal limited access tokens from a Facebook user. So the OAuth callback for CrowdTangle will do this thing where it'll set a cookie that contains a redirect URL on an authenticated page, then follow that with the access token to a potential attacker-controlled redirect URL through cookies. Sorry, go ahead, Steve.
So it is attacker controlled. So the redirect URL cookie is set apart from the actual callback. So just when you access any sort of page that requires a login on apps.crowdtangle.com, which is a first-party Facebook application, any page there that requires a login, it's going to set that cookie and then redirect you to the auth page so you can just log in. The thing is, the Facebook callback, so when you log in using Facebook, it will use that same cookie when it redirects. So Facebook, you go through the OAuth process, Facebook sends you back to this /Facebook/auth page, and then that page will redirect you based on the cookie. The cookie's value needs to be still on apps.crowdtangle.com. You just control kind of the endpoint that it goes to. So then there's an open redirect in... they don't really explain how this open redirect works. They just have this custom page /e/x/x/hash, and that hash part can be some sort of encoded string that represents another URL that it'll send you off to.
Yeah, they kind of keep it vague on the open redirect.
Yeah, it's a little bit vague there, but it's enough information. You get an open redirect there. So Facebook redirects you back, and then you go to that custom page, which then takes to the attacker page. So by starting off a request first that just gets that cookie set to go to your custom page that requires a login, and then you get the user to go to Facebook to log in, or go through the Facebook authentication, so it redirects them to Facebook/auth, which redirects them based on the cookie, which redirects them to the custom page, which redirects them based on the hash to the attacker page. And they just set the response type equals token to actually get the token in the URL and sending it along through all of these pages.
Yeah, so you do get that limited access token through the fragment part of the URL, which is one way they fix this. They make it so it's no longer a fragment part. It's sent as a parameter, I believe, if I remember right from how they did the fix. But yeah, I mean, that access token was pretty limited on its own. It couldn't give you compromise of the account, sorry. So it wasn't like a full attack on just the one issue.
Yeah, it was read-only to the GraphQL database. So basically you could read everything, but you couldn't actually modify much, if anything.
Yeah. They were able to use it as a foothold, though, to pull the CSRF token used in the auth flow through the GraphQL queries. And the way they do that is they send a device login request with some first-party app to get a user code. Then they take that user code and combine it with the stolen access token of the victim, send a request with that over to GraphQL, and that returns a CSRF nonce that's attached to that user code. So once they have both the user code and the CSRF token, they can send another request to the Graph device login status endpoint to receive a first-party access token, which is much more privileged and can then be used to take over the account. So it's a bit of a complex attack, and it involves multiple stages. The reasoning behind those stages, though, is that it allows account takeover without any user interaction, which is kind of what Facebook requires in order to acknowledge it as an issue and pay out for it. So that's why they went through all those steps. On Facebook's side, multiple steps were taken to fix the attack. For one thing, the open redirect was fixed, and the CrowdTangle access tokens can't be used to access the GraphQL endpoint directly anymore. So they can't perform that upgrade attack for upgrading to the better access token. They also switched the callback so that the token was sent as a parameter instead of the fragment, like I mentioned earlier. So yeah, multiple steps were taken. All in all, he got a 30K bounty from Facebook, so not bad at all. That's a pretty nice payout. And yeah, it's one of those issues where it's not a straightforward, just it was missing an authentication check, and I did this. It was kind of a complex flow issue. It does suck that we didn't get any details on the open redirect, but for the purposes of this article, that's not really totally relevant. They also might not have been able to talk about it for whatever reason, so I don't blame them, but it would have been nice to see.
Might not be all that interesting. They mentioned the hash can be manipulated, so it's probably just like a URL encoder type deal. It's probably not all that interesting.
Yeah, so yeah, that's fair enough. All right, we'll move on to WordPress. So Sonar Source put out a blog post about a WordPress 5.7 XML external entity issue that they found. Z, I'll let you take this one away because I think you'll be able to speak on this one a bit better than I can because you have more experience with XXE for sure.
The XXE barely matters with this one. Basically, XXE, you can get code execution from it, SSRF, external XML entities. The vulnerability here is pretty stupid, kind of funny. In versions of PHP prior to 8, the XML loader, they would call this function libxml disable entity loader true. What this would do is it would disable XML entities, external XML entities. I'm not sure if it would disable all entities or not, but they would call that, it would prevent the attack. On 8.0 and above, they wouldn't call that function because it's been deprecated. It's deprecated because by default, it won't do the entities. But when they actually make the call to simple XML load string, they have this flag added on there, the libxml no ent, which, libxml no entities, what that means is that it's going to enable entities, and it will replace all entities. So the output will have no entities remaining in it. Thus kind of the name. So what that ends up doing is it will enable remote or external entities. Basically, so on versions higher than PHP, because it calls that function, or because it calls with that flag, even though the default is not to have entities enabled, it will go ahead and include them, or it will go ahead and resolve them on versions greater than 8, because you never called anything to tell it otherwise. So, pretty stupid issue. Just not being aware of the side effects of the flags.
Yeah, which I do like seeing those kinds of issues because they're kind of fun. Just talking about like it's easy for a developer to not fully read what a function does and the implications of it. And I've definitely been bit by that before too. So it's one of those ones where it's very forgivable, I guess, even though it is kind of a silly issue. But yeah. So that's the first of 2 Sonar posts. The next one is an exciting blog post around PHP, which talks about a vulnerability in Composer, which anyone who works with PHP a lot probably knows about because it's a very popular dependency manager, and thus is also an interesting target for supply chain attacks, as the title of the article suggests. Now, in order for Composer to be compatible with the various version control software the developers might be using, they contain drivers for supported version control software like Git, SVN, etc. And those drivers contain a supports routine, which will take a URL and it'll try to run a command using the specified version control software to check if it's like a valid repo and like if that driver should be used. The problem is, though, that URL that gets passed across is injected into a command that gets ran, but it's not properly sanitized against argument injection. So if an attacker passes like a double dash for the start of the string, they can inject an arbitrary option or argument into Git or whatever other version control is in play. So the first place they highlight this is in the Git driver in the supports routine, but this issue is present in other drivers as well. Such as SVN and HG or Mercury, which I believe is the one they actually take to getting a remote shell. So this is a cool bug that exists in multiple places. At first, the impact seems kind of limited because getting control over that URL as an attacker is kind of a high ask, because you would already kind of need like access to what's getting passed in. But what if this could be used to attack something that relies on Composer, such as Packagist? Well, that's where the issue gets a lot more interesting, because they ended up discovering that through Mercurial, they were able to find an option they could inject, which was the config, which you could use to set up like shell aliases.
One more correction there. I believe actually Composer calls Packagist itself. So if you add a package to Packagist and then look it up with Composer, I had initially wrote a summary that I gave you, Spectre, that was wrong. I'm not sure if you saw that, but
no, sorry. But it's not just your summary. The way I read it was that it was the other way around.
Composer will first query Packagist to obtain its metadata, and then that metadata is what gets fed into like SVN or whatever. So that's where it gets the URL where you can either download like the distribution, so like a already pre-built archive, or you can download the source. It'll get those URLs from Packagist, so then you can add your malicious repo into Packagist and get your code execution through there.
Okay, so you get the vector through Packagist, but then you can also compromise the Packagist server. That's okay. That's a little bit weird the way that it's worded then, because
I'm not sure about the exploiting Packagist server, actually.
Well, the reason I say that is I'm reading the quote.
Yeah,
they mention... I just lost it. They say, yeah, it allows us to execute arbitrary system commands on the packages.org server. So that's where I was thinking that it was the other way around. So maybe it's just worded a little bit strangely and I misread it. If so, then I apologize.
I mean, I'm sure Packages also then uses Composer, so...
Yeah, so it's probably like a symbiotic thing where it's like Composer uses Packages, but Packages uses a Composer, so you can kind of get that.
There's details people can look into. Obviously, we overlook this.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of an interesting situation though, so that's why it's
I like
a little bit confusing there.
The vulnerability, regardless of the actual supply chain aspect of it. I think the vulnerability is kind of neat. I mean, the argument injections in general are kind of neat to see, just because you need some very specific situations to be able to take advantage of it. Like, not every program has kind of an attack that you can do with an argument injection. So when you have it, it's not always exploitable. So it's neat to see when you do have that case, regardless of the supply chain aspect.
Yeah, it's a cool bug class for sure. I agree. It's also one of those things where, like with argument injection, you don't necessarily consider it when you're writing the code. You don't consider the fact that, like, they could inject those double dashes and specify an argument. It's just something that's easy to escape your notice, I guess. So I always like those kinds of issues. With that said, though, we'll move on to some IoT stuff. We have an advisory from IoT Inspector about vulnerabilities in Libra wireless modules, which seem to use Android as a base for the IoT devices. As is the case with IoT, the issues are kind of jokes. The first issue is an authentication bypass because the backend endpoints just didn't have any authentication checks on any of them, presumably. So they had like this front end where they prompted for a password, but that was literally just for the front end. If you just called like the back end, like the underlying APIs, you could just use them. So
yeah, this whole thing is very meme worthy. Like the first one there, like, hey, yeah, there's ADB over TCP as root. So you get a root shell that it'll expose. It's not enabled by default, but, just set ADB mode. The actual configuration to enable it doesn't require authentication. I actually tweeted out about the second issue there. The fact that there is a get pass. So they have this binary service running on Quad 7, port Quad 7. Custom protocol, but they have a get pass command. Why is there a get pass, and why doesn't it require authentication?
Yeah, it's a pretty wild endpoint to have, and you could basically use it to request a device configuration in plain text. And there was another problem there too that was kind of related to it. There was an info leak through another command.
Yeah, all the read underscore commands.
Yeah, you could leak NVRAM, which contained things like the Wi-Fi password and account tokens. That could also just be read out in plain text with no authentication. So just some really strong, some
very meme-worthy issues.
Yeah, that's really wild. Philip the Cat says get pass is probably used by the front end to validate the password. I could see that maybe, yeah. That would be...
Well, yeah, so it's not like a endpoint get pass, Philip. It's still part of their custom protocol here. Sending the null bytes there, ending with get pass, then gets the password in the response.
Which it could still be like utilizing.
It still
on the
could
front
be
end.
Used somehow like that. It's still, if you're writing this code, you've got to feel like something's wrong here.
This just screams like we don't care. I think it's impossible to make these kinds of issues without knowing about it. I feel like it's just one of those things where they do it and they're like, well, do we really need to like put in the effort here and care about this? Like, maybe not. They just continue on. So yeah, these issues are just kind of like messed up. I often say the issues with IoT are pretty like low-hanging fruit, but this seems even worse than many of the issues we've covered with IoT. It's like I said, it's like they didn't even really try. The timeline was also a bit of a mess because at first they struggled to get the vendor to even like confirm any details without signing an NDA. Luckily, the issues did get fixed within 4 or 5 months. But yeah, I mean, it's not super encouraging to see NDAs being thrown around in the vulnerability submission process to a vendor, of all people. Like NDAs are somewhat common in other areas. Like if you're selling to a non-vendor, like maybe like CDI or CRDM or something, but like going directly to a vendor and them asking you to sign an NDA is kind of, it's a red flag. It's not a good sign. We'll put it that way. So yeah, I mean, we kind of say like the response to these issues is where we put more stock into. And if like a company responds well, even if the issues are memes, we kind of like cut slack there, and it's like, okay, at least they responded well. Here, it seems like it was even a mess in trying to address the problem. So, yeah, it's hard to even throw a bone in that respect with this story. But yeah, I mean, if you're looking for some fun bugs that are just like really stupid, this is the blog post for you, I think. But yeah, not too much more to talk about there. Our next topic is a little bit more interesting, though, and it is the macOS Gatekeeper bypass. So this was published by Patrick Wardell. He does some macOS stuff. I think we talked about him before. I think we've covered some topics around him before, but I don't have those on hand. But anyway, this talks about a macOS Gatekeeper bypass. Gatekeeper being the mechanism Apple uses to enforce code signing and make it a real pain to run anything that isn't verified by Apple. To protect the user against malware and malicious code and whatnot. Well, this bug was a logic bug in the policy daemon, which determines what to do on a file, whether or not to let it run, or prompt it with Gatekeeper or whatever, right? The way that's tagged is through a file attribute, a custom file attribute they specify called the quarantine attribute. And these attributes are checked on downloaded scripts and executed files. And it's also supposed to be checked in bundled applications, which contain like the Mako executable files, scripts, whatever. The problem is in this case, in the case of bundled apps, it's possible in the path for script-based applications, you can fool the policy daemon into thinking it's not actually a bundled application. And that's because they do a check on whether or not it's a bundle by checking if the application contains a property list or info.plist file, which is basically like a metadata file. It contains a list of properties like the app's main executable and stuff like that. So if you just don't include that file, it thinks, okay, this is not a bundle. And then it takes a different path where it just sets that allow flag. So because of that confusion with allowing the script-based application to be misclassified, that allow flag gets set, the script can get ran, and there's no like prompt or blocking of that getting ran, even though it's not a signed or verified application or script. So yeah, it's kind of a complex issue. We did have another blog post that talked about this issue that I think was a little bit unaware of the implications there, because it's not like they don't just allow, like it's not like they just don't care about scripts. Like if you just send an application to be installed and it contains a script, they're just like, oh, okay, we'll just run that.
Yeah,
that's not actually what happened. It was actually like an internal confusion that caused a path to get taken when it shouldn't have.
Yeah, so Cedric Owens was the one who actually originally found the issue, although he didn't root cause it to get exactly how it was happening, just he can make these apps that didn't get blocked by Gatekeeper. So he ends up talking about how he made them, and that has the focus on the actual script there, whereas the post that we're actually using on Objective-C.com focuses a lot more on the root cause, or at least has more information about the root cause here.
Yeah, so like it's totally fair that they had that issue and like didn't do like the deep RCA, and they reference this Objective-C post in their blog post, which is actually how I got to it. But yeah, it's not like, I just want to make it clear, like it's not like macOS was just like, okay, we don't care about scripts inside of application bundles. They do try to prevent against that. It's just that there was an edge case basically when it came to checking whether or not the application was a bundle or not. So yeah, it was a little bit complex in terms of the state management. This post is extremely long. It's like 14,000 words. Obviously, we're not going to be covering everything in the blog post. It goes really deep into the background of like Gatekeeper and the internals of it, which is like very interesting, but a lot of it isn't necessary for understanding the core issue. So like if you want that background information, that post is there for you. You can scroll through it. That said, if you were just looking for the issue, you should probably just skip to like the last couple sections basically, and the conclusions. That'll get you like pretty much where you need to go if you want more information on the detail itself. But yeah, it basically comes down to a subtle logic bug. So yeah, pretty cool attack, and it's fun to see macOS stuff because it's one of those targets where we don't get to see it super often. It's kind of the forgotten one in the podcast. All right, so we have another Talos post this week as well. This one a Linux kernel info leak through procfs, through the procpid syscall file. The kernel does have to be configured with the config have arc tracehook config option set, which I think is default set to Y in a lot of distributions. That said, I meant to go and check, but I totally forgot. So sorry. But I believe that should be a default config. But anyway, regardless, that config does have to be enabled. So if the target has a make file set up that doesn't have that, then this isn't a viable attack. But the issue is an info leak due to truncation on 32-bit systems. Fairly straightforward. The object that gets sent out contains fields for 6 argument registers as uint64s. On 32-bit systems, though, they just leave the unused upper 32 bits uninitialized and truncate the write to a 32-bit register. And that's an issue because the procpid syscall function doesn't account for the 32-bit versus 64-bit. It just uses the long format specifier regardless. So you end up getting 4 bytes for each argument register leaked from the stack. So you get 24 bytes of uninitialized data leaked from the stack, right? So it's a stack-based info leak. So this is one of those issues that would be killed by one of the recent Linux kernel security blog posts we talked about, where they automatically zero objects that are put on the stack. But yeah, that's just kind of something I thought I'd throw out there. The issue was introduced in 5.1 release candidate 4 and was patched on December 3rd. I will say, as far as info leaks go, this isn't the greatest kind of info leak you can have as an attacker. Like 24 bytes that aren't even sequential, they're kind of broken up. That's not an awesome info leak. There's definitely better ones out there, but I could see this being exploitable. If you can manage to get a pointer allocated in the slot that you can leak of a kernel pointer, and you can disclose the upper 32 bits of that pointer, that can be extremely useful, especially for a kernel, if you were looking for a kernel heap address, or a kernel text address, actually. The ASLR happens in those upper 32 bits. So yeah, this could totally be useful, but it is kind of not the greatest info leak, I guess, if you were exploiting. Sorry, Z, you were going to say something there?
Well, I was going to say pretty much what you just said. There is the use case for it being able to leak the upper bits, or potentially getting some upper bits there.
Yeah, you could probably get pretty creative with this exploit in terms of how you leak stuff. I will say from past experience, working with stack-based info leaks is not fun because you're basically tied to however the application is compiled and what you can call to line up something to leak there. You're kind of limited in what you can do, and you basically got to brute force to try to find something useful to leak. So this could make for an interesting exploit if somebody wanted to take this and try to chain it with something else. Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to see how they abuse a leak, because those things are always fun to see, because you have to put in a lot of work to exploit a bug like this. So it's one of those situations where the bug is really simple. It's really easy to exploit in the sense that it's easy to see the results. Hey, I have uninitialized kernel data here, but in terms of actually using it, you're gonna have to put a lot of work in. So yeah, it's one of those fun ones. Unfortunately, though, where this is Talos, they don't really go too deep into that process. Though this blog post was a little bit more in depth than they usually go on some of the previous reports we've covered. That's probably just due to the open source nature of the Linux kernel, though. Although on browsers, those were open source and they didn't really go as deep. Anyway, they go into the bug and they show the crash report, but they don't really talk too much on the exploitability and how it can be used. Which, especially for this issue, is totally fair, because on its own, this issue doesn't really get you anything. You would have to chain it with something else. So yeah, it's hard to really do a write-up on the exploitability unless you use a toy bug or something to demonstrate with. So we have the Tesla topic that somebody was asking about earlier. We have a remotely accessible Tesla exploit in this week's episode from Kunamon, I think is how you say it, which details an exploit that was submitted in Pwn2Own last year. This exploit was also detailed in a white paper and a talk that was given at CanSec West 2021. So there are slides available as well as the VOD for that conference presentation. The white paper, I think, is probably the better medium for it if you just want the exploit details. When I looked into the slides, it seemed like they had a lot of like build up to the issue and talking about like other issues that were found with Tesla, which is totally like, I'm not saying that's useless or something. That is some very cool details, and I will probably check out the talk as well. But if you just want the exploit details, then the white paper is probably what you want to check out. It starts off with detailing the entry through daemons running on the service Wi-Fi network, which uses hard-coded WPA2 PSK credentials, which are used on Model 3s and also the Model S and the Model X. They came across a daemon that originally came from Intel called Conman, which I gotta say, like, that is a great name. Like, props to that. But it's a lightweight connection manager, basically. They wrote a quick AFL harness and buzzed it and found crashes instantly, which isn't really too surprising. This is a target that probably hasn't been picked over too well. They detail two of the issues they found in detail. The first being a stack-based out-of-bounds write when parsing domain names when proxying. They have this fixed size buffer of hex 10, they have a fixed size mem copy of hex 10 bytes into a destination pointer, but it doesn't do a bounds check on the destination buffer to ensure that it's within the target buffer's memory. So that can give you an out of bounds write on the stack. Stack cookies here are in play though, so it's not a super straightforward exploit here where you just smash the stack and win. They had to get around this by using a clever trick with how the uncompressed function works, which I think you found really interesting, Z.
Yeah, I thought that trick was interesting. That said, I thought this was in DNS code. DNS proxy. Okay, I missed that. I was a little bit confused by where you were getting the proxy from.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so DNS proxy. Anyway, yeah, I thought it was interesting. I've actually got the code up here on stream now too. They would end up iterating over, they're going through the records, decompressing it, they copy it out into their temporary buffer, and the issue, like, they get this linear overwrite that Spectre was just mentioning, because they do this mem copy on line 41, and it's just the fixed size. They don't do any bound check, whereas this first one, they're doing an strn copy with, like, the remaining buffer size. And then they increment the pointers, the pointer position to say, like, now it's further along. So the trick they ended up doing here kind of took advantage of this subtle bug in that they would calculate this u-length or u-len using this strlen function. They just call that on the name. But when they actually would copy it into the buffer, they're using strn copy. So that's where they're passing in, like, the remaining buffer size. So they could actually have a desync between how much they increment the pointer by and how much strn copy actually copied out. And so with that, they could have it increment further than the buffer actually wrote, and using that, they would be able to skip over the canary and just write the saved return address. So I thought that was kind of just a neat trick to go about this. And just a little subtle bug.
Yeah, sorry, I just had to step away for a second. So yeah, the second less interesting bug that they detailed, but it was still necessary, was in the DHCP packet processing. By sending an option packet with no option data, you could basically leak data through that uninitialized option data, because the packet's backing buffer is never zeroed, like it's not memset or whatever. So that gave them an info leak in order to leak return addresses to bypass ASLR and be able to full chain it for RCE. So yeah, that gave them RCE in the connection manager, which let them perform various actions like access the car's infotainment system while it was parked. They could unlock doors. They could pop the trunk, all that kind of stuff. So it didn't compromise drive control, which is a good thing. But it basically gave you access to anything else. So yeah, pretty impactful RCE. And like you said, I think the exploit strategy was pretty cool. It's I don't know if I've ever seen anything like that with, like, how it was taken advantage of. I can't think of an exploit I've seen that uses that trick.
It's kind of a special situation where you're actually able to increment over it versus just having a linear overwrite. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if I've seen it before or not. Like, I've definitely seen things messing with the pointer increments before. I'm just trying to think specifically to get around stack canaries, or if it was just like get around a crash or something.
Yeah, it basically comes down to just being able to leapfrog that stack canary. And there is this kind of statement I've seen floating around from people where they think stack canaries completely kills stack-based exploits. Like stack overflows are dead because stack canaries exist. I mean, yes, a straight up linear stack smash, those kinds of issues are dead.
Well, you can still target it. You start targeting like the data on the stack, though, which maybe you don't have anything, but the option is there for your data-oriented attacks.
Yep, that's another thing. But like people often forget that like there are stack-based out of bounds rights you can have where you can do that leapfrogging, where you can just jump over the stack canary, and those are always fun to cover because. Like it has a special place in my heart because we actually did that on PS4. QWERTY's 4.55 exploit, I think. It was a BPF stack-based bug. Well, it wasn't like it was a race condition that led to a stack bug. And that was basically what we did there was we just jumped the return, like the stack cookie entirely to just hit the return address. So types of attacks because they're fun to see. Yeah, we'll jump into our next issue, though, which is from SSD Disclosure. It's a bug in Netgear R7000 routers, as well as some exploit details and some juicy drama. First, we'll talk about the bug, as always, which was a heap overflow in HTTPD they submitted through ZDI. The issue is improperly restricting the HTTP post request payload against the content length, because as an attacker, you can control the content length, which is used to allocate a heap buffer, which then gets the data copied into it through memcopy. Because you can control the data and the content length separately, you can cause that discrepancy, which can give you the heap overflow scenario. For exploitation, they attack the allocator itself with a fastbin attack. They basically corrupt the fastbin to return a chunk with a controlled pointer, which you can use to get an arbitrary write. To do this, though, you do need some circumstances lined up. You do need to have two allocations from the same fastbin made in succession. And they also can't exceed the threshold of the fastbin size, or else the allocator will just consolidate the chunks together to satisfy that request. They found an endpoint that satisfied the first condition, but not the second. It would take arbitrary file uploads, and it would do like two allocations in succession. But I believe one of the allocations was like hex 10,000 bytes or something, which is obviously way over the threshold for fastbin. And this is another case where they do a pretty interesting trick that was specific to the scenario that they were able to take advantage of. And that was abusing their heap corruption to cause another issue in the uclibc free function. So this is where earlier I was talking about uclibc. This was the topic I was thinking of with that. So yeah, their free function, if you tried to free an 8-byte chunk, it would lead to an out-of-bounds write, since that would evaluate to -1. And the reasoning for that is usually you can't create 8-byte chunks, I don't believe, in uclibc. It has a minimum chunk size of 16 bytes. But because you've already broken the integrity of the heap, you can forge an 8-byte chunk, and that's kind of where you can create this issue where there previously wasn't one in the free function. So they use that to smash the max fast field of the malloc state object, which happens to line up with the -1 indexing into the array. That way they can smash that threshold so that even though there's like a hex 10,000 byte allocation, it still ends up going into the fastbin. And they can combine that to overwrite the God entry for any function they want to get code execution. So yeah, another bug where the issue is pretty trivial, but the exploit strategy was really interesting and unique. So yeah, we've got a few cool exploit topics this week.
Specifically, their choice or being able to target the max fast was interesting. I mean, the actual heap exploitation overriding the forward pointer, standard fare when it comes to, like, that's kind of what you're targeting whenever you get a corruption in a fastbin. Like fastbin Duke will kind of target that. So fairly standard there, but yeah, going for max sag using that -1 index, I think's a neat trick.
Yeah. Katori 1965 from chat said, "I'm salty. I looked at that binary and missed the vuln." I kind of resonate with that. With some of the targets I've looked at when I've missed stuff, you definitely feel dumb. But it's just one of those things where you're not going to catch everything, right? So it happens. But yeah, I think we have one more exploit topic of the show before we get into shoutouts and start wrapping things up. It is a Parallels desktop post from ZDI. Parallels Desktop is like a virtualization software for it's used on macOS, and they have two hypervisors. They have this proprietary hypervisor, and they use the Mac OS hypervisor. And what they target here in this blog post is the proprietary one from Parallels. So they talk about some of the reverse engineering they had to do because obviously where it's proprietary and closed source, they had to reverse. Luckily for them, they did have like function names. Symbols weren't stripped, so that made it a little bit easier in that process. The function they target is the OTG handle generic command function, which gets called through a hypercall in the UEFI firmware. They found two vulnerabilities, a heap overflow and a time of check, time of use. Basically, it was a double fetch info leak. The heap overflow was the result of the size of UEFI variable names not being validated when passed to commands. So when it attempts to read the variable name into the request name in the host kernel heap, it can overflow, right? Because there's no restrictions on that size. They have a snippet of a panic they invoked by triggering that bug. They don't take it to like full exploitation though. The second issue was the time of check, time of use, which I thought was a bit more interesting. It's essentially a double fetch when reading variable names or querying variable info, which it does revalidate on write requests, but it doesn't revalidate them on read requests for whatever reason. I guess they just thought like reads were safe. So because the value it's fetching is in the guest's kernel memory, which is attacker controlled, they can just put a good value in there, then swap it out later on for a malicious value since it never gets revalidated. They can use that to trigger an out-of-bounds read and get a very useful info leak, which should be chainable with the previous bug for a full escape. Yeah, they don't demonstrate that attack, but it should be possible.
It's not necessarily that it doesn't validate, it's that it relies on the userland side to do the validation, that when it gets that status 0 back, that's when it goes like, okay, it's been validated by the userland side to say it's okay, but there's that race in between.
Yeah. I mean, I love these types of issues because I just love race conditions in general, but double fetches are unfortunately something you don't see super often anymore. Like you used to see them in kernel, but since
I think the last time we talked about hypervisor actually was another double fetch. We've definitely talked about some double fetches related to hypervisor, so I feel like that's something to look for.
Yep, so I was just about to get to that. So like kernel, you used to see them kind of, but since the mitigations have come along that prevent directly dereferencing user memory, they're pretty rare nowadays, and like pretty much extinct. Most of the time getting data from the user is written in a fairly secure way because you're forced to use the APIs. So it'll grab the value and store it in the kernel control buffer. But like you were just saying, hypervisor seems to be the one area where double fetches still seem to be a viable bug class. So yeah, I mean, if you're looking to do hypervisor research, it's definitely one you should be keeping in mind. And it's I feel like we say like kind of the same things a lot on the show because we do, but double fetches are another reason why centralizing code is important. The way that this class of issues was killed in like the Linux kernel and stuff and FreeBSD kernel, whatever, is because you centralized around needing those APIs to cross the kernel and user boundary. So that's it seems interesting that they don't already try to do something like that with hypervisor. I guess it is a little bit harder because you're dealing with like two separate systems instead of just a kernel userland isolation. But yeah, like centralizing everything into an API for fetching untrusted data is the best way to work around these types of double fetch issues. So it's just kind of a point in favor of the code centralization, as you call it, Z, which it shows how like important it is for defense in depth. But yeah, that summarizes all the exploit topics we've had for this week. We do have a few shoutouts as well. I think all of them are yours, so I'll let you take them away.
We've got lots of shoutouts this week, actually.
Yeah, like we got 5, so... Yeah, it'll be a
so-
bit of a longer segment for that.
Yeah, well, I'll go through them kind of quickly here. First one, exploiting undocumented hardware blocks in LPC 55S69. We were going to include this as part of the episode. Fortunately, episode's kind of running long. I don't like to cut content just because it's running long, but it's also an area that I don't think we're going to be able to comment very strongly on. Unfortunately, I actually didn't get a chance to fully read this, but I've seen it getting linked around, so I still want to include it. Seems like it's a really cool write-up. I just can't give a lot of details on what it's about because I haven't actually read it, but it just came out, so, check it out. Hopefully it's interesting. We also have one bug here from Sick Codes with the Python standard library IP address.
Another one.
Yes, it is the same bug as we had in NetMask, where it would accept octal IPs and basically encode them or read them as octal rather than as decimal and just trimming the leading zeros. Same issue as we've seen before, but I mean, Python standard library, somewhat impactful there. Bishop Fox put out a post about ham hacks, basically introduction to like some software defined radio, just kind of getting involved with that, looking into that a little bit, some of the hardware options. Just really basic introductory coverage. This is an area that kind of interests me. So, I've owned a Hack RF1 for several years and haven't really done a lot with it. But always kind of keep meaning to do something with it. So hopefully I'll get around to that eventually.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. Just like the Hack 5 stuff that I have that I will definitely use soon.
Hack 5, I mean, I could go on about that, but I feel like so many people buy that and just become like the pineapple and stuff, and it just becomes a novelty because they have no idea what to do with it.
I had some ideas for what I bought with Hack 5, but yeah, it's one of those things where I buy it and I know I'm never going to use it. So
yeah, I mean, I got my
Hack
RF free back when they first launched. They gave them free to the first like however many people. So I got it back then, but otherwise I probably wouldn't have bought it.
Oh, okay. So you're kind of you don't feel as bad, I guess, about not using it since you didn't pay for it.
No, enough. I mean, I still wish I'd use it more, but yeah. And then next, this was Heapy, a heap or a happy heap editor, based on like GDB Jeff. Basically, just looking there to kind of understand the heap, what looks like a little bit better snapshots. Looks like a really cool tool. Just saw this over the weekend. Probably could help with some CTFs, maybe DEF CON ones, maybe not. I don't know how much heap there was with this year's. But looked like an interesting tool to check out. And lastly, I think, LiveQL. So I've talked a few times about CodeQL throughout the podcast episodes.
Yeah, anyone who's listened for a while knows that Z is a fan.
Yeah, like I think it's a cool tech. I'm excited to see how it goes. I have a few issues with it. Part of that's been just the learning resource, although there's definitely been more since GitHub has made it more accessible. One of the things they've done here is this LiveQL where they